Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 44 of the Ask Historians podcast. So today is one of my favorite topics because it is once again time for anthropology to stalk the halls of Ask Historians. Oh, but before we get into that, I just want to share some amazing news. So Ask Historians, a panel of our panelists, will be represented at the 2016 American Historical Association Conference in Atlanta this December. We've put together a panel. We're going to be giving some talks. It's going to be fantastic, but most of all, I really want to thank all of you who donated. We put up a fundraiser to help fly in panelists from all over the world to attend the conference. And with, well, first I want to help thank the Reddit itself. The admins and the company put up half of what we wanted right up front, so that was a huge boon. But the rest of you absolutely clobbered our goal. We have met our goal. You can still donate. I'll put up a link in the page in case you want to help us meet some kind of stretch goals or or help cover some of your compatriots who were maybe a little over enthusiastic in what they could afford to donate. But we've met the tilt goal, and as of now, we are going to be flying people from as far away as New Zealand to Atlanta to help attend this conference and talk on a variety of topics. Again, I'll put up links to that in the discussion post so you can go see what we're going to be talking about and just the amazing amount of people who came together and helped us support Ask Historians and getting the academic recognition we deserve, I suppose, although we don't really deserve it. But yes, we do. So thank you so much, so much. But on to today's topic. We will be speaking to our Anthropology Nerd, as she writes on the site, about, as the name might imply, anthropology. So there's an idea that history, capital H history, the academic discipline of history, is something that is predicated upon written documents, and that is, of course, a kind of a foundation of the discipline. Taking documents written by a specific person in the past, detailing their thoughts, their actions, or actions around them, or whatever. Someone wrote something down, and that is generating what we can study and textually analyze. But history, of course, lower case H history, things that happen in the past history, does not often have this luxury of having written documents. So in those cases, we need to turn to disciplines like archaeology or anthropology to help us determine what actually was going on at the time. And while these are two distinct academic fields, there's a bit of a false dichotomy in thinking that they can't work together, because very often they do. I know in my own area in Mesoamerica, at the time of contact, we start having written documents and accounts, and we have some older codices that have survived. But a lot of what we do is this combination of both analyzing the texts and then looking at the archaeological evidence. And so there's a great deal of overlap in these things, which we will not be talking about today. Today we are going to be going purely anthropological in this sense. We're going to be talking about really the field of bioarchaeology, which is the study of human remains. So archaeologists study material remains. Those are your artifacts, your remains of buildings, potsherds, everything that was left behind by people, tools, things like that, which are not actually the people themselves. Bioarchaeology takes it and explicitly focuses in on those remains. So we're going to be talking about bioarchaeology, we're going to be talking about paleodemography, which is kind of taking those remains and seeing how we can extrapolate and talk about larger populations from them. And we're going to wrap up by talking about kind of a case study where there's actually some, as opposed to, we spend most of the episode talking about bones, and then the actual human remains, not Bones, the TV show, and then follow up by talking about, in the end, what we can do with some soft tissue by talking about these preserved Inca mummies that are found on top of very high mountains in the Andes. So it's a very interesting, and I hope, well, it's interesting to me. As you can see, I kind of fanboy out a little bit during the episode with Andy, but I hope it's as interesting to you as it was to me. So let's go ahead and get started.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm here with Anthropology Nerd, and we're going to be talking about bioarchaeology, anthropology, paleodemographics, and all sorts of other things dealing with dirt and bones and people who are long, long dead, yet left us very hard, bony remains. So, Nerd, or I guess Andy, if I could call you that, what really got you interested in this subject?
So to go way back, first it's great to be here. First to go way back, I was kind of a odd child. I really enjoyed infectious disease stuff, and I would ask my dad, who had a background in pathology, to talk about diseases. And when I was in second grade, I memorized the cause of death for every U.S. president because I would finish my homework so early that I would be able to read this cool book that we had up in front of the class. And so my second grade teacher was great. I thank her immensely for not telling me that normal people don't talk about how people died. And instead, she asked me to, just look up more of the stuff that I was asking her questions about. So I thought this was fun. I thought this was cool. I went to undergrad thinking I'm going to be a doctor. And undergrad just totally, threw that plan under the bus. I failed freshman chemistry, and I thought, well, I'm not ever going to be a doctor. But I went through the anthropology section of the library one day when I was taking a study break and found all these awesome books that talked about how we know what we know about the past and health and disease in the past. I was totally hooked from then on out. I thought didn't want to do anything else. I wanted to look at bones. I wanted to figure out how people lived in the past, figure out how they died, figure out what we can tell about them from what they left behind, and then be able to share that with the world. So that's kind of how I got into this crazy world of paleoanthropology, paleopathology.
Yeah, so in the American system, of course, we usually think of anthropology as being the four-field anthropology,
Right.
cultural, physical, archaeology, and linguistics. And I've joked in the past that I'm a true four-field anthropologist, and the fact that I feel comfortable doing the first three and then pretending I know something about linguistics. So, but mostly we're going to be looking at physical anthropology here. So, what is physical anthropology, and specifically, in this case, really, we're going to be looking at the kind of subfield synergy of bioarchaeology. So what are those terms?
Okay, so within the big four field that you mentioned, there is biological or physical anthropology. And to put it really succinctly, we study biological and behavioral variation in humans and our hominin ancestors. So anybody under the umbrella of physical anthropology can be studying something as distinct as maybe looking at robust australopithecines, or they're primatologists, they're looking at chimp behavior, or they're modern geneticists, and they're trying to understand how our species spread about the globe and look at big migration patterns. They do that through looking at genetic variation, modern day genetic variation. Or even forensic anthropologists. And so they come in and they would help, when there's only skeletal remains left, they would help authorities try to figure out and identify unidentified remains in a criminal setting. So what bioarchaeology does is they take a lot of that knowledge that we have from other disciplines and we dovetail onto what's already going on. So we'll see a lot of bioarchaeologists working with archaeologists. And, if an archaeologist is digging, they're looking for pottery shards, looking for buildings, looking for material remains of past cultures. A bioarchaeologist is looking for human remains of those past cultures. They work together, hopefully really very well, closely together, and they both together will tell something about that culture. One works, traditional archaeology that we imagine deals with what people create. Bioarchaeology is really looking at the remains that they left behind, the human remains that they left behind.
Yeah, so when you're looking at these remains, what really are you looking for? What kind of information what kind of basic information, I guess at this point, we can get more in depth later, but just for discover some human remains, some human skeletal remains, and what really are you basically looking at for them?
Really, we joke that the first question that you come across some bones, the first question you ask, is this human or is this not human? And sometimes it's harder than you would imagine to actually tell the difference sometimes when they're really fragmentary. The second question is is this old? Do I need to call a cop, or is this brand new recent, or is this really old? So after those two questions, you figure out that
how active is this murder scene?
Yeah, exactly. Is this within my scope of practice? Yes. Then you can kind of go on to the little bit deeper analysis. And so what we're really looking for is we're trying to assign an age to this person. We have some kind of telltale markers that we can figure out how old the person was. We have some telltale markers that we can tell what sex they were. If the skeleton is complete enough, we can start telling things about their ancestry, their background, from where they came from. If we have some long bones, we can start talking about how tall they were. We can start looking into investigations of their health, any evidence of disease. Is there any trauma? Does it look like they've had past fractures that have healed, or something that happened right around the time that they died? Maybe that was the cause of death. We can also tell a little bit more kind of esoteric things, like we can see what muscles they used repeatedly, or evidence of arthritis on the bones to try to get an idea of what they were doing in their normal daily life. And then things like dental disease, did they have a cavity in their mouth, and you kind of imagine, this hurt them this had to have hurt them almost any time they went to go eat anything, or did they use their teeth for tools? Just fundamental insights into how that person interacted with the world every day.
Yeah, just to take one of those, like say age, because I think, of course, most people would be able to say that it'd be very easy to tell the difference between, say, like a child and a fully grown adult. But, when you start to get someone who might be like 20, or maybe someone who might be 50 years old, essentially a fully grown adult, what kind of specific things would a bioarchaeologist be looking at?
Sure. So at first, obviously it's a little bit easier with kids. Our species is fairly regimented in how we develop. So, everybody kind of knows you lose your teeth in elementary school. And so, but that's a skeletal marker that's going to be left for us. So we can kind of judge how old a person is based on how their teeth are developed. Same way with long bones, you reach skeletal maturity late teens and early 20s. And so up until the last part of your bones start developing, we can pretty precisely date how old you are. Again, it gets a little bit harder once you get past, the early 20s, because then you're looking at a little bit more fine-tuned changes to some specific surfaces. We really like to use two surfaces on the pelvis, so that the pubic symphysis and the auricular surface have proven to be the easiest way to kind of tell. And those are characteristic changes that have been verified with reference populations, and we go through a lot of special training, and you see a lot of those to be able to identify what you're actually looking at.
Yeah, and so for those of the people who are not up on their osteology, what exactly are the pubic symphyses and auricular surfaces are probably not on most people's lips on every day. So
yeah, so it's basically the pubic symphysis is right where your hips come together in the very front of you, at the front of your pelvis, and then the auricular surface is basically where your hips meet that big bone in the back of your pelvis, so right near your tailbone. And those two surfaces will change in a way that we've discovered is fairly regular for most people throughout their lifespan. So a 30-year-old is going to look a little bit different than a 40-year-old, and is going to look even different than a 50-year-old. And so we can kind of start to assign some age orders to a person based on the shape and the design of those surfaces.
Now, I mean, are there kind of like reference populations, I think you mentioned, that you can kind of go to and say, like, this is kind of like the standardized model that we're drawing from?
Absolutely. We're not just making it up, but this isn't magic. I don't just lay my hands on the remains and go, oh, this person is 50 years old. I can tell they like chocolate pudding.
That'd be an impressive anthropological feat in and of itself.
Yeah. So basically all of what we know in bioarchaeology and human osteology is based on reference collections. And what I mean by a reference collection is that there are warehouses full of human remains that have been documented. So we know how old this person was, we know what their self-identified race was, we know male or female, we know all of these things. And so for example, at the Smithsonian, there is Terry collection, and that's over 1,700, I think now, skeletal remains of known age, known sex, known ethnicity, known cause of death. So researchers will come up with a question, and they want to say, how does this surface, let's just say the pubic symphysis because we talked about it, how does that change throughout life? And so they will get all of these specimens, line them up, see if they can tell any trends that happen, and then they're going to start writing papers about that. They're going to start publishing. They're going to start telling the rest of us, hey, I think this is a clue. I think we can identify somebody based on this, or this will give us some help. And then that goes through a huge verification process. So another person with another reference collection is going to go into their collection, trying to make sure that makes sense with what they see and what they know. And then eventually it trickles down to people that are in the field, those bioarchaeologists that are, with their little paintbrushes scratching away, trying to remove the dirt from, 500-year-old remains. And then we get this verified information with a pretty good guesstimate range around it. And that's how we hopefully know what we know. Again, our ability to tell this information is only as good as our reference population. So you hope that that's representative, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, what are these reference populations, where are they usually drawn from? I mean, do we have, are they large and stretching across centuries, or do you tend to have very kind of overbalanced or overrepresented in one kind of particular time or age or, you know, ethnic group range?
Sure. So I'm mostly familiar with what happens in the States. There's a little bit different in Europe and in England, and then so I won't really address so much that. In the U.S., we have collections that where a lot of people have donated their remains, and so they go through this entire long process where, you know, they make sure that they're in their right mind, they know what they're doing, they want to donate their body to science, and that way, and then it goes through the documentation of, okay, well, we could get the really specifics of, you know, their age, their sex, their ancestry, but also let's get into their medical record a little bit to figure out what evidence of past trauma they might have that we're going to see, you know, after they pass away and we start dealing with their remains. So a lot of these are donation based. Again, that runs into the problem of, is that representative? For some smaller universities, that tends to be, you know, a little bit higher socioeconomic status, a little bit higher education level, and it tends to be people that perhaps their family could not afford a traditional burial. So you get a bit of a bimodal distribution of who's in there as far as like socioeconomic class. You also run into the problem that in the past, all of these remains were very specifically kind of designed to get capture for pretty much white and black, you know, African American and European American sort of descent. That was what they were aiming for. The demographics of the United States have changed a lot, and we know that that's not really going to capture a whole lot of the variation that we are more likely to run in, like a human forensic anthropologist is going to run into these days. But so there's that question: is it going to be different? Do patterns look different? Are there small differences for, you know, Hispanic populations, for Asian populations, for Native American populations? And that's always something that we're trying to improve on and make sure that we take full measure of human variation.
I know one of the things you also mentioned was kind of a determination of ancestry, and I mean, I also know, like, I could reach back onto my bookshelf here and pull off my, you know, like my Bramblett text and look up like stature estimations. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. If for people not listening, I basically just referenced like a near ubiquitous physical, anthropological, osteological text. It has different stature estimates for different, you know, ancestry. So it says if you have a femur and you think it's a white person, then you use this particular, you know, formula. And if you think it's a black person, you use this, you know, formula. But, you know, perhaps in the past, of course, because of course this gets into the kind of the cultural side of thinking, like, you know, how do anthropologists define race and how do cultures define race? But in the past, we had a much more kind of like black or white. No, that's it. Yes. No kind of shades, you could say in there.
Right. There's no admixture.
Yeah, exactly. None whatsoever. Pay no attention to that. You know, but now, of course, we have a much different kind of modern demographic, and also we have kind of an evolved thing on looking at just how to determine ancestry. So I guess I have two questions. Is that the first being, you know, how do a lot of this be forensic anthropologists, but, you know, how do, you know, people in biological anthropology determine what we call ancestry, and then how do we use that to kind of further interpret our findings from the remains?
Okay, so from when it first started, researchers were trying to build up the best reference population, and I'm going to say undergrad for me. Basically, late 90s, early 2000s, you're still using Howell's craniometric data set as one of the big reference populations. He looked at over 2,500 human crania from 28 populations, and developed these equations. So you have a skull of unknown ancestry sitting in front of you. You can take very specific measurements from very specific markers that, again, we're trained in this. We know exactly what we're doing, and the aim is to have it be consistent across the board, that everybody in physical anthropology will use these same markers in the same way so that the equation works. And I remember doing this mostly on paper, but again, it's based on, you know, these equations from the reference population. Now there's a huge switch because we have this so much available data that we can access online, and we can use computer programs to do this. So there's a program called Fordisk, which is what a lot of forensic anthropologists would do. You take the measurements the same way that we've taken these measurements for the past 100 years, but instead of plugging them into a formula that you have in the textbook that's in front of you. You plug them into an Excel spreadsheet, and then it's going to take that information, look at what's been generated in the past based on reference populations, and spit out kind of a probable estimation for ancestry. And say, obviously there's going to be issues with it if the reference population's not right, and they're constantly updating for this. It is always trying to make sure they have the best capture possible. But that's kind of one of the interesting transitions that I've seen in the field, and I'm not really that old, but that's one of the biggest transitions that I've seen, is that it kind of going away from anything that was a lot of paper-based to we're all using the same equations and we're using the same programs, and everybody's working to make sure that those programs are up to date and they're accurate based on the samples that we know.
Yeah, so I mean, how do, particularly when you're working with older remains, how do you begin to start estimating, what ancestry would be? You mentioned kind of measurements that you would take, and kind of what are some of the caveats of making those determinations?
Well, always, if you're working with older remains, there's the issue of preservation. Always the issue of preservation. We're used to seeing clips of Indiana Jones walking into a perfectly preserved room full of skeletal remains, and everybody looks pristine, and it's a prop set. That doesn't happen for the vast majority of humans. Once they pass on, their remains don't preserve. So sometimes you run into issues with that. A lot of the time, I mean, of course, it's based on context. You're not really going to assume that somebody that has European ancestry is going to show up years ago on the coast of California. That won't happen. But sometimes, nature throws a crazy ball at you. But there are just in general shapes, and this is not my area of specialty, but there are general differences in the way a characteristic skull looks from people that maybe are from African ancestry, a little bit Native American ancestry, or European ancestry. Again, it gets more challenging once you get to more admixture, like we talked about, where those lines are nowhere near as clear-cut as the best image that you see in a physical anthropology textbook. And real life is way more messy than that. So it's really helpful to have these programs and these equations that can kind of help you wrap your head around a little bit and validate or not validate if you're not as skilled like me, what you think you're seeing, so what you're seeing is accurate.
Yeah, not to mention, especially when working with like living populations, because I know you mentioned that in these reference populations we have what people are their self-identified race,
right?
And sometimes that might not, particularly in admixed populations, that might not match up what we see in the kind of the bones. Or even really how they appear a lot. I guess I've kind of betrayed myself, because a lot of this is my field and my background as well, that a lot of times I would think of this kind of little known quote from John Lewis, who was a famous civil rights leader and now a U.S. congressman, who said that the white Southern segregationist is obsessed with fornication, and that's why there's so many shades of black people. So just to kind of be like, it's that the bones don't often quite reflect the more nuances of the social reality, but we're getting out of our field here now. But we've been talking a lot about the kind of these basic or more kind of intrinsic traits, age and height and sex. But I mean, what about the things that actually happen in people's lives? Because I know you mentioned things like injury, disease, diet, things like that.
Sure. So there's a couple characteristic things that we look at as far as insults or signs of stress in people's bones. And there's two kind of manifestations of that. One, it can happen during development. And if it happens during development, sometimes it stays as a permanent marker on that person's skeleton. And so even if they live to be 30, 40, 50 years old, we can still see evidence of that. And one of the really popular, better known instances of that is something called an enamel hypoplasia. And again, big technical term, basically what it means is that during the development of a tooth, there was a huge stressor of some kind. And oftentimes we don't know exactly what it was, but it serves as a permanent line kind of across the teeth.
Yeah, so what do you mean by stressor then?
Well, it can be physiological stress. So maybe the individual is really, really sick or something. It may be associated with the transition from nursing to trying to live on, real diet of hard food, but maybe the digestive system's not really set up for that yet. It could be a big parasite infection. Maybe the person got sick or the child was sick, and that stressor meant that the body was putting more energy into fighting off the pathogen than it was to putting down enamel on the tooth. Basically, the body's saying, I have to survive today. I don't really care about 10 years from now. I have to survive. Other stressors can be huge disruptions. So any kind of, geographic displacement or that might happen with a famine, warfare, anything like that. We don't always know what caused it, but it is this line and it is this evidence that we can see on the tooth. And there are, again, based on the reference populations, we can measure how far that was into development and kind of get an idea of when that stress happened as a kid. So on its own, maybe it's not all that much information because you just have one person, you don't know is that representative of the entire population or not. But if you start looking at trends across populations, then say this seems to keep on happening, then it kind of gives you a little bit idea of what life was like in development for children in that culture.
You brought up actually a very interesting point, because what we've also been talking about here is really individual skeletons here. Mm-hmm. You brought up that kind of when we start looking at this in the aggregate is when we start looking at things like paleodemographics and saying, what was the general health of this population? So right. Yeah, could you discuss a little bit more about that?
Sure. I was talking about these things that happen when you're developing. You also have other stressors that happen when you're an adult. And one of the things that we used to think that we knew, this was, every field has those things that they think that they understand and think that they know. There's evidence of like a nutrition deficiency, specifically in this case iron, that shows up on skeletons and bones. And so we used to think that was a one-to-one relationship. When we see these specific lesions, it means that there was an iron deficiency in the diet. That means that, either these people had really high parasite loads, or they didn't have access to meat and everything. And so we were using this specific lesion to kind of draw parallels between different populations or look at differential access to resources. Like, we don't see that the elite burials have this. We see that the poorer class burials have this. So that must mean X, Y, Z, that they didn't have access to meat or whatever. And so that's just an example of one of the markers that we use to try to say something about more about the aggregate, about what was happening with lots of people in a population and then between populations.
You bring up the idea of kind of like high class burials and low class burials, and I think in a way that kind of reflects what we were talking about with the reference populations, with there being this kind of bimodal distribution of being the people who are too poor to afford a burial and the people who are donating their alma mater, kind of thing like that. So which means that
ultimate display of sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. Or just really trying to earn that A. But so when we're looking back at these past populations, we do have the problem of, I guess the first problem would be, are the skeletons that we're looking at, the skeletal remains we're looking at, because it's usually not complete skeletons, are they really representative of the population we're trying to study? So how do we go about kind of interpreting that and dealing with that?
Oh, you hit on the huge issue within the field. So we, perhaps in our more innocent, naive years of our field, early 1900s, and going up into the mid 1900s, really thought that what we dug up out of the ground was representative of the population that it came from. And that seems like a wonderful assumption to make. It seems like that makes sense and that you should be able to say there's a one-to-one correlation. Toward the 80s and 90s, we really started to question if that was accurate. And there was a lot of debate within the field. There were some major issues that come up. But you mentioned this at the beginning, the field of paleodemography and trying to apply any demographic trends that in a modern population might be relatively easy. So in a modern population, a demographer is going to look at mortality, is going to look at fertility, is going to look at migration. Trying to look at those things when all you have are skeletons and all you have is a cemetery sample, it's not as easy as one-to-one. And we thought it was, and then there was this kind of self-reflection within the field of saying, how do we even know what we know? And again, that may sound like, oh, that's just an ivory tower concern that doesn't really apply, that doesn't really matter, but it's huge because we're using human remains to try to make some big, grandiose claims about human health. One of the most prevalent claims that a lot of laymen probably run into is this idea that human health takes a turn for the worst when we start sitting down, planting stuff, living on our trash, and the whole agricultural revolution, that farmers have lower quality of health than foragers that came before them.
Yeah, and actually the well-known Jared Diamond wrote a pretty seminal article called which he called the agricultural revolution humanity's greatest mistake.
Right, exactly. And if you don't take into account a lot of the issues that go into making a cemetery population, which we can get into if you want to, you come up thinking that, yeah, this was completely bad for everybody involved. This was a humans. Why did humanity ever decide to settle down and start planning stuff? We're just living on our trash. We're just living on our actual reality, living on our crap. This is a terrible, terrible decision. But if you actually look at a lot of the things that influence how a cemetery population or a cemetery sample is made and how those people are selected out of the population, you start wondering, that's not maybe the best way to think about the history of human history and to think about how our health might have changed from these major transitions that we've gone through.
Yeah, so you mentioned, and I guess I'm going to say I do want to get into how a cemetery population is formed. So, so what are the difficulties and what are kind of the limitations in how a cemetery population is formed and what we can interpret from it?
Sure. So obviously, there's always the concern about preservation and who is preserved and who's not. We knew about that. As far as I might say, we main anthropologists knew about that. We knew that some remains were more fragile. They were not going to, specifically children, were not going to be able, their skeletons were not as fully developed, so they're not going to be evidence there in the cemetery as often. We know that preservation is really bad, say, in acidic soils or things like that. So those were things that we knew. But in the early 90s, there was a publication of a paper called The Osteological Paradox. And again, Wood was the main author. Wood and colleagues, they brought together a lot of the concerns that have been floating around in the field and started addressing these concerns head on to say, we really, as a discipline, need to step back and we need to understand how these big grandiose claims that we're trying to make aren't really representative. So, for example, you would have people, researchers, great intentions, trying to uncover more about the past, trying to help us gain insight in the field, but they would uncover a cemetery sample. They would look through everything. They would look at the ages of everybody that was there, and they would come up with mean life expectancy. It's just an average age that you would expect anybody to live to. Now, if you're a modern demographer and you have the best data, that's easy. That's kind of just a bread and butter demographic
You have birth
measure.
records and you have death records.
You have birth records, you have death records, you know that. The problem is that in a skeletal sample, you know nothing about what's going on in that population. And the big assumption is that there's what we call demographic non-stationarity. When you make those mean life expectancy estimates, you're saying the population is steady. You're saying there's no migration. You're saying there's a constant age-specific fertility and mortality. There's no growth. You've got an equal age distribution. And that's completely ludicrous. There's no population in the world that's like that. But in modern samples, you can kind of say, well, we can account for that. And if you're separated by culture and 1,000 years of history, there's no way you know what's going on. And so little things like bumping up the fertility will majorly change your age of death distribution. And I know that seems a little counterintuitive, but all of these factors coming together to say, you have no idea what was going on in that population. You can't create a mean life expectancy. And that's just really silly to try to do that. This was kind of known before Wood and colleagues brought it up, but it was one of those things of like little changes to human demographic measures, specifically fertility, are really going to affect what you see and what you dig up out of the ground.
And of course, this assumes that this cemetery, this burial site is really kind of that all people were buried there equally to begin with, as opposed to some people not being buried there. Some people, there might be different funerary practices, like, a certain class of people might have been cremated or, or buried out somewhere else alone or any number of ways.
Anything.
But
yeah, specifically, children sometimes, even in our, modern Western European sort of background within recent history, children haven't been seen as full adults. Sometimes they weren't buried in the cemetery with everybody else. Or if there was a migrant that came in that wasn't of the same religious background, they weren't being buried with everybody else. It's really silly things like that that can majorly influence what you're saying about the population that makes up that site. And then because people were comparing these measures of, well, people only live to 55 here versus people that live to 65 over there. So people that live to 65, that must be better over there. Well, maybe the cemetery is just whacked over there. We don't really know. So you can't just make these grandiose claims without really getting down into the nitty-gritty of what's going on.
Yeah, and the other thing that is kind of baked into the osteological paradox as well is once we get down to talking about kind of health of individuals in forms of disease, is that not every disease leaves a trace on a bone, does it?
Sure. No. And in fact, bone is one of the last tissues to be remodeled. All of your tissues in your body, with the exception of your enamel and your teeth, and go through a process of remodeling where the older cells are replaced by the newer cells. And in fact, bone is one of the slowest tissues to be turned over. So it also happens to be one of the last tissues that gets influenced by disease. So really, unless it's, a very specific pinpoint sort of like you stepped on a nail, it went right into a bone and now you have an infection, you have to be really, really sick for your bones to start showing evidence of disease, which is good.
Yeah, I know the classic example I usually bring up is when people start talking about evidence of syphilis in say, Europe prior to the Americas. Mm-hmm. And, because syphilis in its late stages, of course, can have some very kind of distinct osteological markers, but unfortunately those can also be mimicked by a bunch of other diseases that were present in the old world.
Yeah, our specificity is not great on that one, so we always need to be worried. And even this kind of bringing it back also to the osteological paradox, this brings us to the frequency of pathological conditions in a cemetery. So which goes right on with this. People would compare, you'd have two very earnest, very well thought out researchers that are trying to argue that because X population has 10 out of 20 people have this pathogen, this evidence of this pathological condition, that they have to be sicker than the other group that has 5 out of 20 people that have this. Now, that makes sense, that on the surface of it, but the joke is that the case is making up a skeletal sample, they're dead. We've stacked the deck for the sick, and we've stacked the deck for the dead. And so you can't go, to use a modern-day comparison, you can't go into a neurological intensive care unit, take the percentage of people who had a stroke, and then say, 80% of these people in this culture have strokes. It doesn't work like that. You never see everybody that was at risk for this specific infection, and so you're only looking at the people that had it. So you're really making a lot of overestimate. There's a possibility, and we now tend to believe it's an accurate possibility, that you're really overestimating the frequency of pathological conditions when you look at a cemetery sample, because they're sick, they're dead, they're in the ground. Everybody else that lived, they're older. You're not going to find them.
Yeah, and also there's so one of my professors used this example when she was talking about kind of looking at epidemiology in the past and just saying like, well, if you have one grave site that has 90% of the people have clear signs of some sort of traumatic injury or disease or something like that, then you say, wow, that those people look like they went through a really rough time. And then you see another cemetery site that has no indication of that particular condition. You say, well, those people obviously got spared. And the point that she made was like, well, maybe the 10% of the people in the first population were able to bury those 90%, and then maybe everyone at that other site died. Which creates a bit of a paradox in what you would kind of interpret.
Oh yeah, of course. And so, if you're looking at, maybe you want to get down to the age-specific mortality, like you want to make a statement about, was life rougher for kids? Was life rougher for, adult males or young adult males specifically. Maybe for whatever reason you're interested in interpersonal violence or anything like that. And you dig up 10 people, 5 of them are kids, 3 are adult males, and 2 are just really, really old. Well, not everybody has an equal chance of dying at any one time. There's an underlying frailty, there's an underlying risk that goes into that. The playing field isn't equal. And so, we know this from personal experience. During flu season, the mortality during flu epidemics tends to be younger people and really older people. Some jobs are really dangerous. The Discovery Channel loves to make shows about those. And then you have people that, even just normal healthy people, after a big stressor like final exams, you tend to get a little sick that week after exams. After you've built up all that stress, your body's saying, I have to live through this fight or flight experience, which is my, chemistry final. And then the next week, it's like, oh, okay, now I'm sick. Now I can't do anything. So the frailty is different. And so you can't make these big population levels assumption about specific mortality at specific ages because you have no idea what was going on for that larger population. You only have that stacked deck of the people that are already dead and trying to make some understanding of how in the world they got there. It's a lot of confounders that come into it.
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about from kind of like a 30,000 feet, very high level perspective. But is there a particular kind of case study which might help kind of narrow or focus this conversation down?
Oh yeah, sure. So one of my favorite things to kind of study is it's not really well known, but there are.
But it's definitely a dead person.
It's definitely a dead person. Most assuredly, very dead. So. During the expansion of the Inca Empire, there was a tendency to offer sacrifices on really, really, really high mountains. And sometimes you can find, not you specifically, usually researchers that know what they're looking for, will find human remains up on very well preserved mummified human remains that were presented as offerings during the Inca Empire. And so I don't know if you want to talk about that, but we have some wonderful mummies that have been preserved up on the highest peaks in the Andes.
Yeah, well, my first question actually be, is this intentional mummification in the sense of because when people think mummies, they think Egypt, but of course, I know that the area is South America actually has some of the oldest mummies in the world, the Chinchorro mummies, but that's thousands of years before the Inca. But where the Inca was this deliberate mummification? Or was this kind of a result of the environment?
No, this was all natural processes. This is not an Egyptian practice where you're trying to intentionally preserve the dead for whatever reason. These were individuals, in this case, children that were offered as sacrifices, and they were placed on the apex of these mountains, which serve in Incan cosmology as a bit of a sacred site and home, kind of seen as the metaphorical and home of the gods. So they would place these children up there. It was just by accident that it was dry enough, it's cool enough, you don't get water infiltration, so you don't get the normal decay that you would down at sea level or even, a couple thousand feet lower. So these are completely accidental mummification, but we get to bear the fruits of being able to study a little bit more about Inca practices during this time.
I guess one of the differences from a lot of what we've been talking about in this kind of broader sense is that with these kind of freeze-dried mummies, I guess you could say, you have something that we haven't really discussed, which is soft tissue.
Right. And so soft tissue offers a lot of amazing opportunities that we don't always have with skeletal, which is purely skeletal remains. So when we were first starting to be able to amplify DNA, we were getting ancient DNA out of mummified remains. And that was human. And at first there was a lot of, back and forth. It was, is this contamination or is this not? So that was great when we found out that it wasn't contamination, and we can actually get human DNA, ancient DNA from these remains. The next step was actually finding evidence of infectious disease in the ancient DNA of these mummies. And so that was great because usually you have to wait until there's a skeletal marker of the disease and not just, I can take a sample, I can look at this, and I can see if there's any evidence of tuberculosis was the first one that was used, tuberculosis infection in these mummified remains. You can look at hair and skin, and all of these, you can look at the isotope ratios for hair, or for skin, or for bone and teeth when they were developing, and then you can start to develop a chronology for this individual.
Yeah, so what's the significance of the isotope ratio?
Okay, so there are quite a few different things you can tell from isotopes, and they're not all based on the same thing. One of the most common isotopes that everybody's familiar with is carbon, and you can use that ratio for carbon dating. This is a little bit different, but in your brain, kind of think back to the same process that we're using for carbon dating. So you can look at a different form of carbon. C4 is really prevalent in maize. And so if you eat a lot of C4 plants, if you eat a lot of maize, the carbon signature in your body is going to be a little bit different. If you eat a lot of nitrogen, we get that a lot from animal protein. So if you eat a lot of animal protein, your nitrogen signature is going to be a lot different than your vegan friend who doesn't eat any animal protein. If our oxygen and our hydrogen isotope ratios are going to be different based on where we drink our water. So that varies geographically, that varies with altitude. So that can start to help pinpoint where people are from, and you can look at migration patterns based on oxygen and hydrogen. And the last one that I'm not as familiar with, but people have looked at, is sulfur, and that can help you determine if the person's eating a lot of marine resources, if they really love sushi, or if they're more just a steak and potatoes sort of guy. So that kind of gets you're able to tell a little bit more about a person than just what the skeletal remains would have told you. And then, like I said, when you look at the different tissues that you have access to, you can start to see changes throughout a person's life, throughout maybe the first couple of years of their life when their teeth are developing. You can look at the enamel. And then if you want to say, hey, what happened in the last year or two leading up to their death, you can start looking at skin, you can start looking at bone, and then you can start looking at their hair, actually cut samples of hair, because we assume it grows about a centimeter a month. And then you can start saying, well, 3 months ago, diet majorly shifted, or 3 months ago, their hydrogen isotope goes crazy different. So maybe they were moving around. Maybe their diet changed. Maybe something changed. And we wouldn't have had access to that if we just had the skeletal remains. That's something that mummified remains help us.
Yeah, and so what are all these isotope and hair and tissue remains, and what do they tell us about these Incan mummies?
So these specific mummies, there are 3 of them. There was a slightly older female that was about roughly 15, and then there were 2 younger children. There was a boy, I think he was around 7, and another girl, and she was around 6. And we knew about the Inca practice. It's make sure I get this right. It's Capacocha, I think, is the name, where part of the incorporation, in the time that the Inca Empire was expanding, part of the incorporation was offering, in a way, a tribute from the new groups that were incorporated into the empire. It wasn't all just military, it was a diplomatic transition. And some way in one of the tributes that you would provide to the new Inca overseers that you had is a child for some of the rulers of those areas. And so we knew we had Spanish accounts of this practice, and we had oral history accounts of this, but we didn't exactly know, all of it. We didn't know what to trust or what not to trust. And, always there's just going back and forth. And so what the oral accounts and what the Spanish accounts were telling us was that the children were taken from, voluntarily given over. It was really against any cultural norms to show any regret or fear about this. It was an offering. It was offering you were supposed to do thankfully. And the children were taken to Cusco. They were feasted. They were dined. They were treated, wonderfully, because they were part of the sacrifice that's ultimately going to be made to the deities. And then from Cusco, they were taken out to what would be their place the final resting place, on these massive peaks and so they served as intermediaries with the deities, but they also served as a reminder of kind of this Inca power and control over the area. So when we started, sorry, that was a long introduction, but when we started looking, when we started looking at what happened to these children, it seems to really start matching up with what we get from the Spanish accounts and what we get from the oral history. This oldest girl, the 15-year-old, had very long hair. And she also had a bag of hair that was found out through ancient DNA to match hers, so we had an even longer sample. And it looks like about a year or two before she died, her diet changes dramatically. Not only is she getting more access to nitrogen, she's more access to meat resources. She's starting to get a lot more maize consumption, and specifically there was a little bit more isotopic analysis and coming into figuring out that she was getting a lot more access to chicha, which is an alcoholic drink that's specific to the Andes, and access to coca leaves. We know that from modern version of everything has it as cocaine, but really it's a common stimulant that's used all throughout the Andes, and you mix a little bit of ash with some coca leaves and it gives you ability to kind of overcome a lot of exhaustion, helps with altitude sickness, it helps with upset stomach, it helps with a lot of different things. It's nowhere near as powerful as refined cocaine. But her world changed dramatically when she was selected for this. And then we can follow her through these isotopic analyses, follow her to Cusco. And then all of a sudden the diet shifts a little bit differently when she's making that final pilgrimage, and as well as the two younger kids. Their diet changes when they're on the road, when they're moving out from Cusco and they're going down to the mountain. And they have to rely on the grain stores that are along these awesome Inca road systems. They have way stations and they have, the maize stores that are there. So the diet shifts. She's still getting feasted. She still has access to coca, and but life's a little bit different. And then finally, in the last couple of weeks before her death, we see a little bit more signs of stress and everything getting up to the last little bit to get up to the mountain. But yeah, so it provides a completely different perspective than we would have if we just had the bones there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, have they examined the bones for these sacrifices as well? And I mean, how would they go about doing that? When you have a mummy, how do you get to peek at the bones?
Oh, well, archaeology is a destructive science. We know that. We try to limit its destruction. And I think in this case, they're really trying to limit the destruction of the mummies. They want to keep them as intact as possible. Good thing is we have awesome remote kind of sensing that we can do with CT scans, CAT scans. And so these remains were placed through and very awesome. One of the references I'm going to link is you can see the evidence of see what happens when we did a CT scan of the older child, the 14-year-old maiden. And again, we wouldn't have as much access to her bones because of that, because they wanted to keep the mummified remains kind of intact. But through the CTs, we were able to get a better visualization. We were able to see a little bit more of what her bones looked like and get a little bit more insight into her. But a lot of this knowledge is coming from the soft tissues that we wouldn't normally have.
Thank you for kind of give us that little kind of applied case study there.
Yeah.
I think I want to kind of bring us to kind of an epilogue here, but a lot of what we've been doing, particularly in the first part of this, is talking about the uncertainty and how a lot of these remains can kind of give us false impressions. So I guess in kind of an epilogue, I kind of want to ask you, what good is this?
Yes, no, I would still like my friends to have job security. So yes, we could still tell a lot about the past. No, this is awesome way. This is an awesome way to start investigating other things that we can't always answer through archaeology, that we can't always answer through oral tradition, and we can't always answer through written accounts. Because not everybody gets written about, not everybody is, their oral tradition is passed down, and a lot of times we don't have evidence for what these people live like. So if you don't have the means, the expertise, and the background to be able to start investigating this, you really run into this black hole of knowledge. And so a lot of what bioarchaeologists see that they're doing is they're taking these dry bones, they're kind of putting flesh on them in a way and telling a story about this person. And it's different from archaeology. Archaeology can kind of tell a story about a place, or it can tell a story about an artifact. But when you're doing a really detailed analysis of one skeleton, you really start to feel like you're giving voice to that person in a way. You're telling their story. Okay, I know their tooth probably hurt when they ate. I know that they like to use their right arm more than their left. I know they probably walked with a limp because it looks like they had a bit of a fracture when they were younger. on their leg, but that's healed now. But I don't think that they walked, completely right. You kind of personalize the past in a way that's not open for everybody in a population to have access to normally. Normally that personalization, you can get that through writing, you get that through the traditions, but this is looking at, the skeleton of a person. This is looking at who they were and telling more of a story about how they interacted with the world. And ultimately, that's what's fascinating to me, is seeing how human interaction with other humans, human interaction with the environment, human interaction with, in general, has changed over the course of our history. We're a relatively young species, but a lot of things have dramatically changed. And so that's fascinating for me, and that's personally why I'm driven to this area of research.
Well, Andy, thank you very much for speaking to us on the Ask Historians podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And as always, thank you for listening. It is your support, both morally and downloadingly, that lets us know that the podcast is reaching people and that you appreciate it by leaving notes on the discussion boards and coming up with questions for our speakers afterwards. We appreciate it, they appreciate it, and we hope you appreciate it as well. And also, again, thank everyone who donated to the AHA fundraiser. We had no idea it would be this quite so successful, but we're very touched in our deep, dark, shriveled historical hearts. So hopefully this episode, however, has given you a little bit of an idea of the methods and theory that go into interpreting human remains in a historical setting, not necessarily in a forensic setting, although a lot of these same techniques can be carried forward. But taking those, old human remains, the very bare minimum of what has been left behind of a human being, and interpreting them not simply in a population context, but I really appreciated Andy's point at the end about how it's a very personal thing to be working with human remains, that you very much are handling a individual human being. And that is, I was thinking at the time, I made a point at the beginning about how historical research is focused very much on, one person writing something down, and that can be a very intimate act. But it can also be in a different way, but no less intimate, perhaps even maybe a little more intimate. If you're holding someone's femur in your hands, that is a very intimate act as well. So I hope that came through, as well as some of the more, 1,000-foot top-down theorizing that we talked about as well. So coming up in 2 weeks, the next fortnight, we will be talking to Chocolate Pot, and we will be talking about Regency-era fashion. So that's the period in the late 18th to early 19th century. If you've seen Napoleon or Marie Antoinette in that dress, we will be talking about that and kind of the changes that went on in that period and how that kind of presaged the modern fashion industry. So I hope you'll tune in then. Until then, please rate and review us on iTunes or whatever streaming service you use. That helps get the word out. So if you want to talk about bioarchaeology to someone else, they'll know what you're talking about as well. Until then, see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.